how God restores a marriage. The improbable happened. Our destroyed marriage was restored by God. No one could imagine something like this would happen, but God did. Do you believe in miracles? Well, this is my miracle, the miracle of the restoration of my marriage. Subscribe to my channel and review all the content to strengthen and heal your marriage relationship. God bless you. Today, I want to share with you my entire story of marital breakdown and restoration to strengthen your faith and trust in what God is capable of doing. It started as a cute and beautiful love story. We met very young. He was 21 and I was 19 years old. We both had a missionary calling to serve God full-time, so we had early begun to travel and study to dedicate ourselves to the Christian mission. He from Brazil had traveled to Chile to study the Bible in a 9-month boarding school, and I, Chilean, had traveled to Brazil to receive missionary training for 1 year. So upon returning, we met in Chile at an event that brought together people with the same interests. We could say it was love at first sight. Our eyes crossed, and our common plans made us immediately think there was a connection between us. Some would have said it was destiny, but we knew that God was joining our paths for a purpose. Despite our enthusiasm for starting a relationship, we were both so clear about our mission that we decided to take time to pray and know what God thought about our relationship. So for 6 months, we talked, prayed, and got to know each other more deeply. At the end of that time, we felt that God confirmed to us that we should unite our paths, and with the blessing of our families, we began our dating relationship, committed to get married. A year and a half after we met, we got married. He was 23 and I was 21. We were very in love. Our love was evident to everyone who knew us, and we sealed our commitment by getting married in Brazil and then asking for God's blessing in Chile with our family and friends. On our wedding day, it rained a lot, which we interpreted as an omen of blessings that would come our way, although we were a little frustrated because we couldn't have the outdoor ceremony as we had dreamed and planned. The desire for missions burned in our hearts, and for that reason, after 8 months of marriage, we made our first missionary trip together to Egypt. The objective was to get to know that field to decide if we would start a project in which we had been invited to participate. They were very hard months because it was not what we expected, and we found that inexperience and youth were not appreciated in that place to be able to start a job. It was also a time to get to know each other in other areas and to strengthen our bond as a couple, overcome obstacles together, and plan for the future. We decided to start the family project soon, so during the trip I became pregnant with our first child. Upon returning, with clearer ideas, we made the decision to start a family in Latin America and work on the mission, but on this side of the planet until our children were older and we had acquired experience to share in places like that. After the birth of our son, we went to Brazil for our first official mission, planting a church in the city where my husband's family lived. It was a challenging mission because we experienced many hardships, and it was necessary to start the work from scratch, with opposition, many struggles, and sadness. They were the first years of marriage, and we began to face some crises. Looking back, I can see clearly that many of those crises were caused by our immaturity and inexperience. The differences between us quickly became visible, and we began to have arguments due to communication problems, cultural differences, because we both had very strong and proud characters, and because we gave space for the negative circumstances we faced to affect our relationship. The first major crisis of the relationship came in this period. I felt alone, far from my family in another country. As a new mother, I was faced with the burden of motherhood, and in addition, the demands of the ministry made me feel emotionally unstable. He was also experiencing his own internal crises, having to overcome ministerial challenges, criticism, demands, and disappointments. We did not know how to deal with the crises we faced, and that aggravated the situation. He ran away to his mother's house every time we argued, and it made me constantly angry and frustrated, until I asked him to let me travel to Chile to visit my family. I needed a break in the middle of the internal battle, and he agreed. However, he felt that I was taking a step back from the relationship, and that hurt him a lot, as he would tell me later. The trip helped me organize my mind and quiet my emotions. However, I had difficulties with permission to travel back with the small child, which required my husband to have to travel to pick us up in Chile in order to return. That allowed us to talk about our crises, and we got ready before the trip. The time that followed was filled with many difficulties and problems, which led my husband to a depression that made him want to give up on the mission. We decided to return after leaving the work on track, and I had to take on the last few months because he gave up on everything due to his discouragement. We returned to Chile to try something new. This time, we were faced with the challenge of forming a missionary training center from scratch. It was a very good idea, but we didn't imagine everything it would require to carry it out. We went to live far from the city, in a secluded place, a place with country life, sacrifice, where you had to work very hard and where there were also many lacks of everything. You can imagine that it was not easy at all. Each small step was with immense sacrifice, from the formation of the courses to the construction of the place to live, all with a lot of effort and putting all our dedication. The years went by, and the family also grew with the arrival of our second child. And as the family grew, the challenges increased, and the crises in our relationship became more acute. Our cultural and family differences were combined with differences in thinking, the way of doing things, and how we worked together, sharing everything. Most of the time, we began to compete at work and make our divergent ways of thinking evident and get things done. I began to constantly go into crisis. My emotions fluctuated, and I felt depressed on many occasions, regretting having gotten married and starting a family so young. The weight of all the responsibilities at such a young age made me start to look at everything negatively, and this internal crisis became evident on the outside, leading me to collapse on many occasions and tell my husband what I felt. I became a controlling woman, to have control of everything that happened around me. I assumed a demanding posture, constantly criticizing my husband, pointing out his mistakes, dishonoring him in front of others, provoking constant fights and arguments. In short, I became a witch. I didn't realize how I was assuming more of a controlling mother role over my spouse than that of an understanding wife. I mistakenly thought that I could get honey out of the honeycomb by hitting it, as my husband always told me. The relationship deteriorated quickly. Our constant fights over these divergent points of view became more and more common. We could spend hours fighting, each one giving arguments better than the other, even spending sleepless nights arguing to see who would win the argument. We oscillated between times of war and times of peace, but our crises became evident to those who lived with us. We could no longer hide it. I became manipulative and proud, doing everything to make him do things my way. With shame today, I recognize that I did everything wrong. I was jealous and insecure, and my words and attitudes were not loving. Looking back, I see that he made an effort for a long time to overcome my actions. However, as time went by, he no longer reacted to my attempts to control him, and I began to notice a change in his attitude, becoming more hostile, more unloving, more aggressive in his responses, and began to oscillate between depressive times and angry times. He took refuge in the computer that at that time made its appearance with the novelty of the internet and the possibility of globalization and staying connected to the world through pages, chat rooms, and similar things. He began to lose interest in the ministry again, and his depression became increasingly evident. He distanced himself from me more and more, and although looking back I can see his sporadic attempts to change, he finally gave in to dependence on the computer and the internet, and that was the beginning of the end. His computer addiction strained the relationship so much that we began arguing every day. He stayed for hours in another room and no longer interacted with us as a family. His attitude changed in that he was now aggressive if I reproached him or demanded that he change. My loss of control at this point caused me to make serious mistakes, such as cutting off the internet to see if he would react, but causing him to become more angry, or abandon him, taking the children to my mother's house, asking my parents to talk to him to see if that's how he would react. But the truth is that not only did he not react, but he made the situation worse because he became full of a lot of bitterness towards me. Many times during this time, I even told him to go back to his country if he didn't want to change. I yelled at him many times that we couldn't be together, but deep in my heart, I never wanted him to leave. I just wanted to make him react, because I thought he would never leave us since he loved us so much. I had no idea of the power of my words. I didn't realize the damage I was doing with my uncontrolled tongue. But soon he started telling me that he didn't love me, that he no longer felt anything for me. He became cold, proud, and rude to me. He also began to change in the sexual area. He became demanding, wanting to do things in bed that caused me discomfort and pain. Everything was going from bad to worse. Our 9th wedding anniversary was approaching, and the crisis was getting more serious. We sought help from some counselors and pastor friends, but to no avail. The crisis was unleashed. It seemed as if a black cloud had settled over us. I continued serving God, praying and reading the Bible, but I was very blinded to everything we experienced, because due to my pride, I could not see my mistakes. I judged and accused him, and recently, I began to suspect that he was cheating on me, which brought me a lot of insecurity, anger, fear, and anguish. But I couldn't prove anything. I only saw strange behaviors in him, secret things he was hiding, suspicious attitudes, and a sudden interest in looking more attractive, losing weight, and buying nice clothes. In the midst of that crisis, due to my turbulent emotions that affected my hormonal processes, I became pregnant without planning it. This obviously caused more tension because the relationship was so strained that he took it as a cop-out. Finally, as a way to give a truce, he asked me to travel to his country to organize his personal affairs and finish a course he had started to qualify as a pastor. The trip had a double objective, not only to finish his training in the church, but also to promise to think and organize his thoughts to see if we could get out of the crisis. And so he left at the end of November 2001 for Brazil. It was an unusual departure because he said goodbye to me and the children very emotionally, with tears in his eyes. It was a very sad moment for everyone. A few days later, he writes me an email and tells me of his decision to end the relationship and asks me to go to Brazil as soon as possible to sign the divorce so that he can start his new life. This was a very hard blow for me because even though I was very aware that the last year had been a year of crisis and many fights, I was not emotionally prepared for him to abandon us. I couldn't understand it. I couldn't assimilate how easily he threw us away, that he left me 5 months pregnant and simply decided to turn the page. His main argument was that he didn't love me anymore, that he didn't feel the same way about me, and that he didn't want to relive what he had faced in the last few months. It was like a trip that left me on the ground. I was stunned. I felt, first of all, anger, indignation, because I could not accept that he would ignore the relationship and the family so easily. Then I became sad, crying daily with great pain for having lost our love, because the family was broken, because it did not fit into my mind that he had given up on everything. I cried many tears when I saw and heard my little children who did not understand why Daddy had left and did not return. Friends and family in shock, unable to assimilate what happened. Nobody expected it. My family welcomed me into their home and gave me financial and emotional support at the time of crisis. The long days of crying began to affect my pregnancy, and I began to experience symptoms of loss, so the doctor recommended rest. This helped me postpone going to Brazil to sign the divorce as he had requested, which had further strained the long-distance relationship since he used many arguments and manipulations to demand that signature from me. He told me that he wanted his freedom to be able to open a company, to start his new life again, and that he wanted to have a clear conscience. The first months of his departure were dark and sad. In March of the following year, with 1 month left until the end of the pregnancy, due to an emotional overflow, my labor was precipitated, and I gave birth to our little daughter. It was a moment of great pain and tears, for being alone at a time when we should be experiencing the joy of the arrival of our child. But God was with me and gave me encouragement and peace in the midst of the storm. Those 4 months until the birth of our little girl were key months in the restoration process, because in the midst of all my pain, I turned to God with all my strength to understand what was happening. Many voices confused me, telling me many things. On the one hand, my family, who took my pain, told me not to cry for him, to rebuild my life, because he was a scoundrel who was not worth my tears. My pastor told me that he was not worth it and not to worry because there were many men who would want me to marry me. It was then that I decided to stop to ask God what he thought and expected of me in all of this. I began a deep search for God in prayer and fasting, begging him to reveal his will to me. I didn't know whether to persist and fight to save the relationship or give up and start a new life with my 3 children. God then reminded me that 3 years earlier, we had received a written vision from a missionary pastor friend who lived in Spain. He had sent that vision through a letter, and at the time, we had not understood it, and therefore, we dismissed it. But that vision spoke of a time of crisis and an end of restoration. So I held on to that vision as the answer I sought from God. In the vision, he saw the whole family in a small boat that lost its oars and was dragged by currents of water towards a cliff. The ship broke down and we all rushed to the precipice, but soon a great hand descending from the sky took us and placed us in a quiet place. The storm passed and we hugged each other, looking at each other with respect, grateful for having gotten out of that. I began to have many times of prayer seeking God to show me the way to follow. I began to understand that God had a vision greater than mine because he had the spiritual dimension of what was happening to us, and I began to ask him to show me prayer strategies and how to relate to my husband from a distance. In the process, I was guided by this missionary pastor friend to ask God to show me my heart, to seek my part in the entire crisis. This is how God began to reveal to me all those attitudes of pride, contempt, and foolishness that I mentioned before, that were my contribution to the crisis. I was able to visualize my heart hardened by the sin of pride, and God was showing me how I had been manipulative, unloving, selfish, impatient, and foolish in the way I treated my husband. It then took me to a period of restoration of the past. He instructed me to ask my husband for forgiveness through letters for all those attitudes that I now saw and recognized as wrong attitudes. He told me that I should not expect him to react to my request for forgiveness, nor should I have any expectation that it would cause a change in him. I had to do it to restore my own life before him and my heart. I recognized my mistakes and asked for forgiveness for all the things that God was showing me. Still, my husband's heart remained hardened. His attitude towards me remained hostile and distant. He told me that we could be friends based on our common children, that he felt affection for me as the mother of his children, but that he did not feel more love, so I should not get my hopes up because there was no possibility of restoration between us. He gave me 3 oaths declaring that he was a man of his word and that he would do what he said. He swore that he would never return to me again, that he would never return to Chile, and that he would never work in the ministry again. Realizing this truth devastated my heart, but God urged me every day to look only at him. He guided me to take my eyes off my husband and put them only on him. He showed me that victory was in believing him because he was a God of restoration, an almighty God who was not limited to circumstances. He told me that even if I saw something with natural eyes, I should believe him, that he was capable of doing the impossible in the eyes of men. And so I did. I clung to God with all my might and stayed in that position despite my fluctuating emotions. God's instruction was that I maintain a harmonious bond with my husband, even though he had an indifferent and hostile attitude towards me. This came at a high price, because those around me insisted that I punish him for his decision to abandon us by not allowing him to have contact with the children and refusing to communicate with him. But it was not what God had instructed me to do. When our little daughter was born, something powerful happened in her heart. That night, he could not sleep due to an inexplicable restlessness that led him to cry a lot for no apparent reason. And just that morning, our baby was born. The next day, he found out by message and understood that she had called him with her cries, although I always say that it was my tears that called him from a distance. From that day, something began to change. He did not insist again about the divorce, and our long-distance relationship began to be more cordial. I did avoid talking about intimate matters, and our conversations were more of the everyday type, to recount what happened with the children and the baby. But at the end of May, he had already promised me a visit to Chile to meet the baby. We had begun to plan his coming, and the children had high expectations. My family was not so excited, but little by little they were opening up to the idea of a reconciliation. In June of that year, an event gave a twist to the story. Our computer that had been broken for a long time was finally fixed, and in a search in the files, I accidentally discovered romantic conversations that he had had for a long time with a woman from Brazil that he had met in a chat room. The world fell apart for me. All my deepest fears came true in that moment, and many things that until that moment I had not been able to understand began to make sense. It was a very hard blow. My dignity as a woman was severely attacked, and I was filled with rage, pain, and bitterness at the discovery. Everything dirty was exposed, and I became sick inside when I realized all the lies and deception sustained for so long. I felt like a fool for having believed, for having trusted, and my world fell apart. The pain I began to experience at this point was different from the first period. Before, it was pain for not finding a logical explanation for his abandonment. However, now he felt indignation and rage for all the lies that had come to light. I decided to think carefully about my steps and sent him everything I had discovered, so he knew that everything had already come to light. But I decided to wait to tell the rest of the people. My husband's first reaction was pride. He acknowledged that he had been unfaithful, but showed no real regret. I again pressed him to react and take a stand, but he remained silent for a while until he finally spoke out. In his statement, he acknowledged his mistakes, but he was also categorical in revealing all my mistakes that had led us to that point. They were very tense days. For my part, my heart remained full of bitterness due to the discovery, and I fell into a period of depression and pessimism. For his part, he closed his position and decided to remain silent and not speak about it. God made me uncomfortable to take steps of forgiveness. And although I did so immediately upon discovering it, every day I had to make the choice to forgive again, because those thoughts and memories of what had happened constantly came to my mind. At that time, my eyes were open to understand the situation more completely, and I understood that he had abandoned me to go and rebuild his life with this woman he had met online. The pain was enormous when discovering this terrible truth and realizing that if before it seemed difficult, now the possibility of restoration seemed impossible. His entire sexual addiction and the doors he had opened in that area of his life were also revealed. This was an area where God had already worked on him when he was single and had been victorious. However, throughout that period of crisis, he opened doors of sin again, and he fell deeply back into his addiction. Knowing that I was coupled up and committed to someone else devastated me. It was a period of realizing that circumstances were worse than I had previously imagined. Every time I went to God in prayer with my broken heart, he not only lovingly consoled me, gave me strength, but also gave me prayer directions and pushed me to pray more and more and not let go of my husband. God told me clearly that although he was with that woman, in his eyes I was still his wife, the official one, and the other was the lover, even though he was gone. God told me that I should not give up on my marriage, and that now I had to fight with spiritual weapons for restoration in the spiritual regions, because now I was aware of the magnitude of the spiritual ties that kept my husband tied and captive. I stayed clinging to God, with ups and downs, without cutting off the relationship with him, taking constant steps of forgiveness, and the relationship began to strengthen. And although he didn't react well at first, he finally felt like he could talk to me openly, now that everything had been exposed and I had forgiven him. We then talk about a possibility of saving the marriage, of fighting to save the relationship, and we agreed that he would come to Chile to visit us and meet his little daughter, who was already 6 months old. That meeting was key for what was to come. We both had fears, but we agreed to talk in person when he was here. God was wonderful and prepared everything for our family reunion. It was a time of opening our hearts, asking for forgiveness, and dreaming of a possible restoration. We take advantage of every day together to talk, to confess, to forgive, and to be with family. There were also moments to restore with my family and talk with them. Upon returning to Brazil, he promised to make a way so we could try again, but he told me he needed time. Time to get away from that relationship in which he had gotten involved. Time to organize his mind and heart, and time to love me again, because he said he no longer felt the same love that he once had for me. God had guided me so tenderly throughout that time that I decided to be very cautious with my words and actions, because I understood that in that meeting, the future of our relationship and family was at stake. I accepted his terms and also committed to paving a way for us to be together. His main condition was that we all had to go to Brazil to live there with him. This caused me a lot of fear and insecurity because I didn't know what that would mean in practice. But when I prayed, asking God to show me whether I should go with the children or not, he told me that I should go and that I should put my complete trust in him. Not only did he strongly confirm that I had to leave, but he added that he had a special mission for me in Brazil. I then decided to walk by faith, and from the moment I was certain that we had to go, I left my suitcases ready, waiting for the moment when God would say yes to the trip. And so the months passed, and after a year, the four of us left for Brazil. My family supported me with many fears, but trusting in God. We got there, and with a lot of effort, we began to rebuild our lives. The first few months, we had the support of my mother-in-law, who graciously came to town to live with us and help us with childcare while we both looked for work. She was my faithful prayer partner while we were still waiting for the complete work of God in my husband's heart. It was a difficult time, but God was with us and blessed us in every way. He gave us both a job, a house to live in, a church to congregate in, and unconditional friends. And although he had made a commitment to fight for the relationship, he was reluctant to return to God for the first time. That made him remain tied in his area of weakness, and for some time he was still involved in infidelities that brought pain and discontent to the family. He was always willing to change, but time and time again, he relapsed. My heart as a woman hurt, and many times I thought about giving up on the relationship. But every time I prostrated myself before God with those thoughts, he encouraged me not to give up and to fight in prayer in the spiritual regions so as not to hand it over to the enemy on a platter. And so I persisted in prayer, waging war against Satan for my husband's soul, crying out day and night for his deliverance. Circumstances arose in such a way that he reached a crossroads. That day I confronted him in love, telling him that I could not tolerate his unfaithful behavior forever, and that he should open his eyes to see that he had a bond in that area and ask for help. His first reaction was unexpected, and he made the decision to leave because he felt discovered once again. But after a moment, he returned and sat next to me with a broken heart, recognizing that this problem was stronger than him and that he could not overcome it alone. He agreed to receive spiritual counseling from a pastor, and I committed as a wife to be with him in the gap so he could be free. During those years, the mission that God had for me was to make disciples among some artists we met in the neighborhood where we lived. They became very close to us and established themselves in their relationship with God more and more, to the point that they were my prayer partners for the restoration of my marriage. With them, we began to study the Bible in depth, and since my husband was a deep Bible expert, I invited him to help me with the studies for them. At first, he reluctantly agreed, saying that he would prepare the study, but that I would have to teach it myself. However, as time went by, his enthusiasm in studying and preparing the teachings was so great that he began to teach us all. And there God began to speak to him. With amazement, but with gratitude, I began to see how God spoke to him and answered all his concerns. I saw how he vibrated with each word of God revealed, and I began to see him break again. Each day his heart softened and he surrendered to God little by little. They were spiritually powerful days, days when he cried and broke down in front of us and asked us to pray for him to heal in areas that God was showing him. And so God was completing the work in our marriage. The first thing I saw being restored was my husband's love for me. He no longer told me that he loved me for a long time, because he said that he had lost that feeling for me, but God had shown me that I should sow seeds of unconditional love in his heart without fainting, regardless of his response, in the trust of that one day those seeds would bear fruit. And so it was. One day I saw that fruit germinate. That day he finally declared to me that he knew that I loved him, like no one had ever loved him, and that he now loved me like he had never loved anyone. And that was the beginning of a harvest of abundant, unconditional love that God gave us in our relationship. Then I watched as God restored his relationship with him. God literally drew him to himself with cords of love, and through reading his word, comforted him, healed him, guided him, and broke his chains of sin. That time was a tremendous time where we saw him being released. A notable event of that period was when he, in front of me, got rid of all the pornography he had saved, this being the beginning of his healing and restoration of sexual addiction. Finally, God restored his heart regarding ministry. That happened while we were studying the book of Acts of the Apostles. There, God placed that flame in his heart again to serve him, and he began to dream of the idea of returning to work in God's work. When God does something, he does the work perfect and complete. He did a work of jewelry in our marriage, treating and perfecting every area that had been affected and hurt. He healed my heart and transformed my character to lead me to be a wife who loves with agape love, who forgives, who is understanding, affirming, and supportive of her husband. In my husband, he did deep work to break his bonds of sexual sin, heal his wounds, and answer all his questions. He returned his love for me, his love for the ministry, and finally he gave him the desire to return to Chile, the place where everything broke, to restore and restart another stage of our life. Be certain that for God there is nothing impossible. There is no hardened heart that can resist him. There is no oath that prevents the purpose that God has already decreed. There are no chains of sin so great that he cannot break. There are no circumstances so terrible that he cannot change. There is no heart so closed that it can resist his presence. There is no life that cannot succumb to the amazing power of intercessory prayer in the spiritual realms. The improbable to human eyes happened. God changed our lament into dancing. He gave us a new future and hope. Not only did he complete the work of healing in our hearts and family, but he called us to serve him by helping many other couples going through this same dark journey with biblical advice. He has raised us like a lighthouse in the midst of the storm to illuminate the path of other wounded couples towards God. In these last 12 years, we have helped more than 500 marriages that have been impacted by our testimony and by the teachings of the Word to strengthen the relationship. And we can affirm that we serve an almighty God who is capable of making water flow in the arid desert and move mountains from their place. This is the God we love and serve. And do you think he can do that miracle in your marriage too? If you would like to experience the same thing that God has done in our lives, I invite you to join this community that prays and fights for restoration. Follow us on this channel, share this content with those who need it, pray for this ministry, and tell us where you are from and what your process with God has been like. God bless you. Subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share with whoever needs it. It's free, and that way you support the ministry. I invite you to read my book, Restoring My Wounded Marriage, which is available on Amazon.com. There you will find wise advice based on the Word of God that will help you on the path to restoration. Thank you. God bless you.